Okay, so I'm Pablo Caif, and I'm here to talk to you about custom view controller presentations and transitions, and a way that I found to try to simplify them. Even I was struggling with trying to find a title that it will summarize everything, and turns out that the view controller transitions, the custom transitions, are not an easy thing. They are actually quite hard, and not because it's complex to implement it, but more because of the moving parts there are in the implementations themselves. But actually, they have a nice angle to it, which means that for me, they're actually pretty cool. And I find like a whole bunch of nice advantages. They provide a advanced user experience, especially when you find a way of implementing a custom transition that makes sense and takes the user through the flow of how a view controller is being presented. I think that really makes your app a lot more polished, and it gives a certain sense of quality. Of course, it's important the internal quality, but it's also important the external quality, how it looks. And I think that final touch adds a lot of nice quality to it. And since we got now, most of the devices are actually have quite big screens, and you got like in the far top left corner, the go back. If you add the interactive transitions, which is like a complementary part of the custom transitions, that allows you to connect a gesture recognizer with the presentation and the dismissal, that actually makes much easier to dismiss view controllers if you just can swap down. And all this stuff differentiates your app from the rest of the apps in the App Store. So when I started looking into it, I went through all the WWDC videos, Apple Docs, few examples, and I was like really, really confused. So I tried to break it down in pieces to show you how it works, or at least how Apple has defined them. So let's say we want to present a view controller. If we want that view controller to be presented with a custom transition, we need to provide a transition delegate. And this delegate will have the job of providing the actual animator, which is, it needs to be a class that adopts the protocol UI view controller animated transitioning. And through this, we can create the animation. And then once we hand this over to UIKit, UIKit will, let's say you're trying to do like a cover up, like typical model view controller presentation, right? UIKit will, once you instantiate your view controller, UIKit will do all the lifecycle goals in the view controller, such as view did load, view will appear, view did appear. It will do all the layout and everything. And then it will clone your from view controller, and it will clone your to view controller, and it will create this UI view controller context transitioning object. It will add them there, and it will also add a container view. And then it will add that container view to the window, and it will ask the animator that you have provided to start the animation. The animator can have access to these contexts, and is able to get the source view controller, the from view controller. And you can do something like, for example, you can add the source view controller, and if you're doing a cover up, you can add the destination view controller to the view hierarchy offset by its height, and then just do an animation that it will just set the frame as the actual final frame. And then once you add that to the animation, UIKit will run that. And once it finishes, it will remove this from the window, and you will end up with the actual destination view controller. If we want to add the interactivity to it, we need to adopt this protocol, which is called UI ViewController Interactive Transitioning. That allows the connection between the gesture recognizer and the progress of the transition of the presentation itself. And by using this, we can tell the context, how the animation needs to progress, and whether it needs to reverse or not. And if, for example, we're using navigation controllers, UI navigation controller, slightly different, we need to adopt the UI navigation controller delegate. Pretty straightforward, isn't it? I don't think so. The first time I saw this, it was like that. I'm still actually pretty confused. So I started thinking, going through these examples and seeing like cases where people is just adding all the stuff to the view controller, massive view controllers with all the animations, tracking the gestures and stuff like that. And I thought, how can I build this in a way that it works for me? And I had a few goals for it, and I've been trying to improve it with the app, with my own apps and some apps at work. So the first thing I really wanted is for the transitions to be reusable. Which is actually pretty handy. If you come up with a nice transition, it'd be really good to just plug it into a new view controller and just use it. I want it to be testable, so if the dependencies are well defined and it's just doing one thing, the testing becomes much easier. And all that comes together to having small view controllers, right? We have all the code in the view controllers trying to do everything. It's not testable. It's very difficult to reuse, and it's not maintainable. And for that, I wanted to have like a clear architecture where the pieces, they have like well-defined responsibilities, and the layers are small enough so they can, do all the stuff that I was talking about. And the last bit that I wanted to have is the platform-specific bits to be self-contained in a small part. So, for example, if we're doing this presenting a view controller for tvOS might be different than presenting it for macOS or for iOS. So with all that in mind, I just built a very simple demo app, and I'm going against the flow. Instead of adorable cats, I got adorable dogs. So let me show you. So I built just this simple app, which has a whole bunch of adorable dogs. This dog there, that's my dog. She's Nala. And as you can see, I got my custom transition. For example, I got my settings there. This is like a regular sort of model presentation with tons of settings that confuse people. And it manages both the scrolling. You see how it bounces back, but I can also do the interactive transition by swapping down. And I got a bit more elaborated transition, which is a push view controller. So this is a navigation controller. And when I tap on an image, it does the push, but it actually animates by zooming in. And there is also a interactive transition where I can slide down and it will start the transition and complete it if I get to the final point, or if I pass the half, or if I just let it go, it will just reverse back. So I'll show you a little bit how I built this app and how I structured all this stuff. So I was trying to find an architecture that it would work for me. I know there are a whole bunch. There is MVVM, there's RX. For me, I found that Viper works sort of good in terms that I like how it structures and separates layers. So the way I implemented this is having a wireframe, which is the one in charge of instantiating the view controller, and calling the view controller.present And I don't want, as I said, I don't want to have all the view controller doing all the networking and all this sort of stuff. So instead of doing the networking calls, it will ask a presenter to get some view models, which then we'll end up calling an interactor, which will be doing the final, call to the networking service, and there will be transformations going through, so that each layer has like the well-defined responsibility. So what I've done is, instead of normally in Viper you would have the wireframe being owned by the presenter. In my case, because it's easier for me, I have the view controllers owning the wireframes. So if a view controller wants to present something, it has a injected dependency on a wireframe and just calls the show or present. So if we go into the detail of how the presentation happens, let's say we have a presenting view controller. As I was showing you there, the settings, the docs gallery. You want to present the settings. We ask the wireframe, and then the wireframe instantiates the presented view controller, and it sets itself as a transitioning delegate. It returns the animator, which is going to be doing all the animation. And because I have this interaction that I need to track, I also need to have an interaction controller, which it will allow me to attach a gesture recognizer to the view, and then it will be able to track and calculate the progress of my transition. And the way the presented view controller communicates back, say if you want to dismiss, because we know that with UIKit, you don't want to have a view controller dismissing itself. What we do is, I have this navigation delegate that it will send the call back to the wireframe, and because the wireframe knows the presenting view controller, it can just do the dismiss. So if we go into detail into each one of the pieces, the view controllers, the first thing, of course, they don't know about the view controllers they want to present or they need to present. They don't know how to instantiate it. They just know that they need to present something. And they ask about all the data they need to present on the screen. They ask it to the presenters. And the presentation happens through the wireframes. So, as I was saying, they know about a wireframe that can present a view controller or a screen, and they just say show. And the dismissal happens through this navigation delegate pattern, which is the way of going back. And I'll show you just very quickly the code for my view controller. So this is like a very simple view controller that has a collection view. And the moment, for example, if someone taps some settings, you can see there my wireframe that it could be injected through dependency injection or just through the instantiator, the initializer, sorry, which makes it easy to test, right? Because then I can inject a mock and track that the calls happen. As you can see, there is no animation code in here. There's just the regular, the delegates, the data source delegates, which could easily be also on another class. Let's go back to the presentation. So the next part is the wireframes, and they are in charge of coordinating the presentation. By this, I mean they are in charge of saying, start the presentation, here is the animator, here is the interactive transitioning controller. And they, as I was saying before, they communicate with the presented view controller through this navigation delegate pattern. And they also behave as transitioning delegate, which is what we need to do if we are using this custom presentation. We need to provide transitioning delegate. But they don't do any animation. There's no animation code in there, and nor any tracking of the gesture. So if I show you the code for that, just going to go through small bits and pieces. Actually, this is in GitHub. I'm going to put the link at the end of the presentation. So for example, here you can see the show settings. That's the instantiation. And it does this configure for interactive presentation, which will set itself as a transition in delegate. Sorry? Yeah. Yeah, it's like a standard function. I don't want to go into a lot of details, but yeah, you see there's not much to it. It's basically, sets itself as a transition in delegate, and then that's the configuration for the interactive transition stuff. Oops. Let's go back to the previous one. And because we are adopting this UIKit protocol, I need to provide the slide down animated transition and then slide up, which in my case, they are slightly different. It could very well be just one if your transition is very simple, and you could be passing something that it tells whether you're presenting or dismissing. The animator is the class that it will be adopting this ViewController animated transitioning, and it will be responsible for animating the whole presentation. And as I was explaining before, we have in this context the destination, the from and the to view controllers, so we need to take them from there. And if we want to have more elaborated or more advanced presentation, say for example Photos app, I don't know if you've seen in detail when you drag down a photo, it actually does the presentation, starts the transition, and then it pauses until you let go and sends the photo to its original position in the collection view. In that case, we actually need to use multiple UIView property animators, which allows us to pause and advance transitions and also to set different timing curves. That could be useful, for example, if you're applying a blur effect on a background view and you want it to go faster or slower that the rest of the presentation is going. And UIKit, because they can get we can report the progress of the transition, UIKit can reverse or progress this transition. And of course, it's very important that at the end, we clean up everything. Because remember, I was telling you that UIKit removes this container view from the window. If you end up with a different state, like slightly different than the final state, you will see a jump, like in the animation. So I'll briefly show you how the animator works. So in my case, what I'm doing is I'm just defining a superclass. I tried to do it through a protocol, but because we are adopting this ViewController animated transitioning protocol, I couldn't have it as a protocol extensions. So I wanted to have these functions in there, which actually come up pretty handy. So this basically is the mandatory stuff you need to provide. Transition, the duration of the transition. You need to provide something that starts the animation. So I have something that creates my UIView property animator, and then it starts the animation. And then you also need to provide an interruptible animator, which is used in order to stop the transition. If you start going back, it will reverse the whole thing. And this is the last bit of the whole puzzle. This is when we want to have this interactive transition. So what my staff is doing is extending the UI% driven interactive transition, which allows you to report a percentage of progress of the whole transition, which at the same time adopts the ViewController interactive transitioning. And as I was saying, you can connect the gesture recognizer with this class, and you can calculate the progress depending on how much you've moved, and then UIKit can progress or reverse the transition. And of course, we need to have something that is able to detect if you have started a transition and needs to call the dismiss on the presented view controller. And yeah, if I show you the code for that, which is actually quite straightforward. You can see here the regular, so when it gets instantiated, it will attach the gesture recognizer to the view, and I provide that view through a protocol. So the view controller, the presenter view controller needs to adopt this protocol so that I can tell what's the view where you want to attach the gesture recognizer. And in my case, because I'm doing this double gesture recognizer, there is the scrolling gesture recognizer, and there is also the one that I'm attaching. I need to provide something that it will allow me to say if I can start the transition or not. For example, if I'm exceeding certain offset of the scrolling. And here it's just like the regular gesture recognizer handling. You can see here if when it begins, it starts the transition and it asks the transition delegate to start the dismissing. And also the progress is calculated here. And we can update the progress, which is what UIKit will use to progress or reverse the transition. Something that I forgot to show, sorry, is the animation itself. So this class that, when I was explaining about the animators, this create animator has all the logic that gets the destination view controller and the to view controller from the container, prepares everything, and eventually just creates the animation. So as usual, I had my own struggles with UIKit. So there were a whole bunch of lessons learned. So the first thing is, as I was telling you, that UIKit clones the from and the to view controller, and that's what you get in the context. If you ever try to access the IB outlets on those instances, your app crashes because they're completely invalid. So leave them alone, don't touch them. If you actually need to access to a view, you need to provide some other way, maybe through a protocol, or maybe, I don't know, using view tagging. I mean, there is no other way than going down in the view hierarchy. If you had references as IB outlets, that's not going to work. I found some issues with rotation. So, for example, if I do a model presentation, then I rotate. And then I try to start doing the dismissal. And for some reason, UIKit gives me the to view controller, which is the one that is behind, in its original old position, not the rotated position. So I always need to make sure that to force the frame of that view to the current frame, so it does all the layout, internal layout calls, and that's with the right screen. When we are providing this interactive transitioning, the moment you give it to UIKit through this transitioning delegate, UIKit will automatically start that interactive transition, whether you actually started with the finger, with the gesture recognizer or not. Which means if you hit the go back button, it will start an interactive transition and will get all confused because there's no progress being reported. So there needs to be certain logic that tracks whether an interactive transition started or not, and also that if there's no interactive transition that started, you can return just nil, so that UIKit can just use the regular progress of the animation. Always is a good idea to try to use snapshots, especially when you have complex view hierarchies, because that speeds up the whole thing. And remember that, as I was saying, this is just clone view controllers. Any manipulation you try to do on them, it's just going to go away. And also, it's very important to make sure that the initial and the final state match exactly with the original view controllers. If not, you're just going to see a jumpy animation or weird stuff. So that's all. Any questions?
Compatibility is iOS 10 Plus, the same. What is the lowest iOS version compatible with?
Sorry, can
What is the lowest iOS version it is compatible with this technology?
I think it started on 7, and they gradually started adding more stuff.
Animator is certainly 11 Plus.
No, it's not 11. I'm
Or 10 Plus.
pretty sure you're talking about the iPhone or the iOS version?
iOS version.
I'm pretty sure it was 7. Yeah, it was quite, I mean, they didn't have all the UI view property animator, which is pretty cool. You can stop the animation, pause the animation, and move it, progress it, or reverse it. It was like a regular animation. And then I think on 10, they added the...
So first of all, a comment, and I'd love to be proven wrong if somebody managed to make it work, but if you go and make a custom presentation controller, be warned that it only works for a full screen presentation. You cannot present and do a custom presentation over a current context. So if you try that and spend days trying to make it work, because it's a nightmare, make sure that you really want to do a full screen presentation. Just be warned. There's a radar open for like a few years and it hasn't been fixed. Second of all, I have a question. So you install a gesture recognizer on your view for the interactive transition. You install that as it starts, or is that installed anytime? Like, I'm not really understanding when the gesture recognizer is installed so that it recognizes the gesture swipe down. Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, so that happens the moment you provide the, when I instantiate the destination view controller, the one that I want to present, right? And I configure it for presentation, I set the wireframe as a transitioning delegate, and I configure the gesture recognizer on the view that the view controller reports.
So it's installed on presentation and is always
prior
there
to the presentation.
as long as it's there. It's always present. Okay.
Yeah, it's always there. Yeah, so that's why you need to have a bit of logic if you have a scrolling view. There needs to be a bit of logic to allow both gesture recognizers to work together. Yeah.
Hey, I was wondering, so you mentioned that you had trouble with IB outlets and manipulating view controllers when the transition is in progress, is that right?
Yep.
This doesn't exactly match the experience I had with this API particularly. Is it possible that maybe the reason why outlets weren't available is because the view wasn't loaded at that point when you were reaching them? Because I don't think the view controllers are being cloned or anything. They do move in the view hierarchy. There's like a pretty freaky process when the UI could actually, it kind of extracts the part of the view controller, the presenting view controller, and puts it in a different, the UI transitioning view, and that's the same context view, sorry, the content view, whatever it's called, that's reported by the context, and that's also where the presented view controller gets to. But those are live view controllers from what I remember.
So what I found is, I was actually trying to extract, so as you see in my collection view, I got an actual cell, and I can get the coordinates of the cell, and I need to know what's the selected cell. And every time I was trying to access, I can't remember what was the IB outlet that I needed, maybe the collection view, yeah, so that I could get the coordinates. I would keep getting this crash. So I was looking and seeing what is actually referencing to. And it was actually a complete different IB outlet from another view controller. Then I started debugging and seeing the instance, the memory address, and they're actually completely different to the destination view controller. You can see if you put breakpoints once you instantiate the view controller, right, you see all the calls happening on the life cycle. If you watch the pointer of that one versus the one that you extracted from the context, is a different pointer.
It's good that you have that on open source. I'll take a look.
Thanks. Just a question on the, you mentioned you had problems with the rotation.
Yeah.
I think there was a function, I don't remember what the name of it was off the top of my head, but there was a function to call on like the view controllers and say like, wait till resize happens or something like that. Have you tried that and did that help you with the rotation?
No, I haven't tried that. So is that when you're taking the snapshot, or?
I think when you're trying to grab the views from the view controllers to manipulate them to do the transition, you can tell them to, I guess, finish transition or finish resizing, because sometimes there's like layout stuff that's still happening. And so that's a good way to make sure that they're at their final state before you start manipulating them.
Yeah, I'll look that up. Yeah, thanks.
Just completion routine. We just take completion routine. You have completion routine when animation completed.
Yeah, this is before, at the start of the animation, to get the final, so you have the full state, or I guess your view controllers are at their, they hit the phone screen and everything, or they're at their final rotated state before you start manipulating them for the animation.
Any other question?
Thank you so much.
Thank you.